pivot now to talk about the project plan and the elements to what's included in a project plan and what are the pieces that you really should have thought through before you turn your attention to seeking funding for a project. We do at the bottom, you'll see the CAP Network Project Builder tool. This is an Excel-based tool that I use in my own practice. So, and then obviously we use it at CAP Network as well. And it's a tool that I've used to build projects with very, very small community-based organizations that are seeking $5,000 or $10,000 for a small project in their particular village. It's also a tool I've used with organizations as big as like Children Believe, which is recently renamed from Christian Children's Fund of Canada, to build $10 million or $20 million projects. So it's a tool that's really versatile, but essentially it helps you to build out all of these pieces if you don't already have a system or an approach to doing that you find is working for you. So it's there if you'd like it. And I think we're going to do a follow-up training, Katie, a couple weeks down the road or later. In more you're interested. Flip the tail water. And that's the part of your project that you're going to be talking about with funders or with donors. But in order for that part to make sense, you have to have the full piece, all of that support that's underneath the water that no one else is going to see. All of that really needs to exist. So it's one of those things that while funders may not ask for your nitty-gritty details in every aspect of your project, when they read your proposal, they will be able to tell whether or not those pieces exist somewhere in your files. And they need to know that that exists in order to feel confident in moving forward and funding your work. Because those are the pieces that are going to convince them that you are likely to achieve the results you say you're going to achieve, and that you're likely going to be able to make good on the promises that you've made in your proposal. So these are the elements of a strong project plan. And to be clear, most of these are not written. So or they're not like narrative. These would just be pieces or tools that you have to use to map things out that you can then turn into narrative answers to proposal questions at a later time. See some flashing in the chat box, Katie.
Yes, one question about the problem. Yeah. Should it be as a narrative or should it be in bullet points?
In this project plan?
Yes.
Bullets are fine here, because when it comes to the actual project, for every funding proposal, you're going to likely have to present things in slightly different language, in a slightly different way, depending on how the funder has requested information. So here, I think it's not about format or syntax or pretty language. It's really about just getting the information captured somewhere. So that everyone involved can understand it. So bullet points, point forms, or even links to external documents are fine. Yeah.
Yeah, since this is your own internal document.
That's right, this is internal, yeah. So it's a sort of the brief outline so that you know who are the target beneficiaries, where are the boundaries of where you're going to work physically, the geography of where you're going to work, essential timeline. So not necessarily to say we're going to start in August and end in April, but rather this is an 8-month project. So you don't know when exactly it's going to start. You might want to make notes around on the timeline how long you think the project will take, and any notes around seasonality that are important for aspects of your work so that you know, for example, growing seasons. You know, if you're working in agriculture in any way, it doesn't make sense to start in the middle of a growing season if you're working with farming communities. If you're working on an education project, it doesn't make sense to start in November if school started in September. So those sorts of notes are important. Again, outlining the specific need that this project is addressing. And this is a subset of the greater needs that you will have described in your case for support, and specifically identifying the challenges or systemic issues that this project is going to address, and links to the best practices in research. You don't need to write it up. This is not an essay. It's not going to be, this part's not going to be submitted to anyone, but you might want to make a note to say, we're going to build on the approach used here, and you can link to a piece of research or a project report that you can then refer to later. Make sense?
Yeah, there's one question about the budget coming up, but I think you're about to address it.
I will.
And then there's another more general question about application forms, and I'll just flag it for you now. You can answer it, or we can leave it for the discussion if you think that's more appropriate. So often there's not enough space in an application form to explain all the ideas that we want to include. How do we decide what to pull out and include?
We will definitely get to that a little bit
Great.
later. Okay, but remind me if I don't cover that, okay? As much as the whoever asked the question was looking for. So at this point, moving on to the next piece of the project plan is a logic model. Now this is not universal. Not everyone builds projects using the logical framework. However, I personally think it is the most robust and useful tool for project building. It also happens to be the standard for many institutional funders. Here in Canada, it is the standard for Global Affairs Canada, and therefore for many other institutional funders.
Give me
okay. It's also, you know, in the UK, DFID also uses it. Most European funders use it. USAID uses it. Everybody uses it in a different format. Sometimes it looks, it's vertical, and sometimes sort of vertical, the way it is here in Canada. Sometimes it's horizontal. Get a sense, if people could just, anyone who's on video, or if you can just in chat, has anybody ever worked with a logic model before? Is this sort of a familiar term, or is this brand new information? So I can get a sense of that.
We've got a couple of people writing yes in the chat, and I think coming from an international development kind of academic background, so that's definitely something that's covered in school. We've got a lot of yeses coming in. I'll track who those are from. One no and a few yeses. Yes, yes.
Okay, fair enough. So this will go over in great detail in the second part of the training. But essentially a logic model, or sometimes it's called a results chain, is a way of thinking through the design of your project, flowing from the results that you want to achieve. So in the vertical format of it, we would store, and well, in the horizontal as well, you would start with what is the, like, ultimately the long-term goal that you're hoping to achieve through your project. And then you think through, okay, well, if, in order to achieve that change, what are the more immediate or short-term changes that we first need to create? And then what are we going to do to achieve those changes? So it's like, it's a logical sequencing of that basically is your hypothesis for what your project is going to accomplish and how you're going to do it. again, we're going to go into this in a lot of detail later, but it's really a way of thinking through your project design so that you're tying it to the change you want to create as opposed to what you're going to do. One of the biggest, I can tell you hands down, the biggest mistake that people make in funding proposals, and anyone who works for like foundations or any granting body will tell you this, that this is a very common error, is when you come into a question in your funding proposal or your application that says, what are your goals or what are you going to accomplish? A lot of answers are focused on completing activities. And so for example, you would say the goal of our project is to drill a well in a village. Sounds great. It is not what are you going to do, but what is the change that you're going to create? What the funder would be looking at in that case is not, we're going to drill a well. It's that we are going to eliminate waterborne illness in children in village X. Or we are going to, say, for example, in the Rainmaker, we are going to support expanded agriculture through irrigation in community X. So the point is that you're talking about creating change in people's lives as opposed to completing an activity in your project. So a logic model forces you to connect what it is you're going to do with the change and the vision of what will be different if you do those things. Is that clear for those of you who haven't connected with a logic model before? Is that enough of an introduction at this stage?
Yes, and I think that there's a couple of people maybe asking if there's some different terms that are used that would mean something similar. So one person mentioned results framework.
Yep.
One person mentioned
results framework.
Result
Yep.
chain.
Yeah, results chain. Yep. Same thing. It's all based on the same ideas and principles, but yeah, there are different. In some cases, you might be using the word objectives as opposed to outcomes, results, impact. All these things, they're sort of used differently by different funders, but the basic premise is the same, that you are taking action to create change, and they want to know what the change is that you're going to create. And there's different levels of change.
Great. So one question, I think Odiaka, you had your hand raised. So did you have a question?
Yeah, but it has been cleared already, so thank you very much.
Okay, wonderful.
Great.
And then finally, is the theory of change an element of the logic model, or does it sit here? Does the theory of change sit here?
So the theory of change. So theory of change is very interesting. So theory of change is essentially the newest application. Essentially, it's sort of taking your logic model to a new level. And the theory of change is based on your logic model. So you can't write a theory of change without a results chain or logic model in place first. The additional component of the theory of change is the identification of the assumptions that you're making in your logic model and linking why the pieces of your logic model are related. So a logic model might say, just think of a good example here. We would like to, the ultimate goal is farming community X is able to continue food production in the face of climate change, or a changing climate or changing weather patterns. In order to do that, they need to change the way they're farming. So a behavior change that is climate adaptive agricultural technique. So they need to start farming differently. In order to farm differently, they need to develop new knowledge. They need to learn these new skills so that they can farm differently and be successful in the face of a changing climate. So that would be like that would be built out in your logic model. The assumptions and the connection would be explaining how you're going to ensure that training people and helping people develop new knowledge around farming techniques. How will you ensure that that means they change their farming practice? So you're making the assumption that with new knowledge, people will change their farming practices. How do you know that's going to be true? How are you going to assure that's true? That's the part that you explain in your theory of change. That makes sense?
Thank you. That's all for now.
Okay. And again, so the nitty gritty of all of this, for anyone who's interested in learning the tool that we've we used here at CAP Network, we are going to be doing a detailed training on how to do that walks through and has some examples built in for what that looks like as well. So the next piece that you really need to have in place is a very strong and well thought through costed budget. The important thing here is that your budget be linked to what you're actually planning to do in your project plan. So you can't really build your budget until you have built out your results chain, which tells you, okay, this is what the tangible activities we are going to do through this project. And then you need to determine what those activities will cost. Again, one of the no-no for proposals, a thing that happens a lot and the funders see right through, is perfectly round numbers. So if you submit a proposal to a funder and you say, this proposal is going to cost exactly $50,000 US, that's going to raise a red flag immediately with the people reviewing your proposal, because no project costs exactly $50,000. And it's an indication potentially that you haven't really thought through what are the actual expenses going to be to implement your particular project. It might be that you're rounding up, and that's okay, but you need to be wary of that. Whereas a proposal that comes in and says this is going to cost $47,000 or $51,000, $52,000 gives, funders are going to take a closer look and see how you arrived at those numbers. Funders also tend not to look favorably on proposals that just give a very round number that happens to be the highest amount in the range that the funder is willing to fund. So if they put out a call for proposals and say, we will fund projects up to $50,000, and they get a whole slew of proposals in asking for exactly $50,000, that's going to make the proposal that asks for $48,500 look more intriguing, right? Because it's going to be, looks like it's more costed, and it looks like you're asking for what you really need, as opposed to just asking for the maximum amount of money that they're willing to fund. That said, if your proposal is going to cost more than $50,000, then go ahead and ask for it. You can ask for $50,000. You just got to be able to show why you're asking for that $50,000 when the project's really going to be 58, for example, and where you're going to get the other funding from. But I think this is really important. Every funder has a different budget template, and every funder likes to call things by different names. They roll things up into different groupings. So it's really important that your budget be developed completely separately from any funder application. What you want to do is build a budget that tells you exactly what you think it's going to cost to do the things you want to do. The project builder tool that we use actually populates the budget from your logic model. So it prompts you to think through the costs at each activity level. Once you have that, it can be really easy to then just code it to a different funder. And we're going to look at how we do that in a minute too. A piece on the work plan. This is really important to think about your timeline. and how you're going to, making sure that you're going to be able to achieve what you set out to achieve within the timeline that you've proposed, or within the timeline that the funder is imposing through their own parameters. I think it's really important to work backwards when you build a timeline, a work plan. So from from the end of the project and working back to make sure you're allowing enough time for each piece of work, and that in fact what you're proposing is realistic in that time range. One thing, just as a note on that to keep in mind as you're building projects, is that when a funder says that they will fund a project for 12 months, they don't really mean it's a 12-month project. They mean you can only spend their money during that 12-month period. So from a project implementation perspective, that's probably an 8 to 10-month project. Not a 12-month project, because you're going to have to allow time for gearing up, for hiring staff, potentially for building the relationships, for getting started, and you're going to have to allow time at the end for your monitoring, evaluation, and reporting back to that funder. So that's just a note to keep in your mind around what timelines really mean, and make sure that whatever the timeline you're proposing and that a funder is talking about, that you allow 1 to 2 months at the beginning and 1 to 2 months at the end, longer if it's a longer term project, to make sure that you're giving yourself time for all of the wrap up and evaluation that you're going to need to do. Otherwise, you're going to end up doing that on your own dime, because your funding you're not allowed to spend money after the end date of the project.
A couple of questions coming up.
Yep.
One about the budget. Could you please touch on budget notes and cost sharing elements of budgets?
Sure. Budget notes are used to explain anything to the funder that you think might not be obvious to them. So if there's see if a good tangible example here. Communications, for example. A funder might have a line for communications. It's pretty vague. That can mean a lot of different things. So if you're proposing a significant amount of your budget, or any for communications, you might want to add a note. Do you mean airtime? Do you mean conferencing technology for meetings? Like what element of communication are you talking about? Or are you talking about how you're going to communicate about your project to a broader audience? So anytime there's any room for misinterpretation or different interpretations of a budget line, I think it's important to provide notes. I think one of the things, and this is applicable to most of your work as well, is if you're proposing a project where you are sitting and you're asking and you're proposing it to a funder that is not in your country, is not in your, may not be very familiar with your particular context, there may be contextual issues that need to be explained, or costs that might seem high or different from what a funder would expect, because they don't understand the particular context of where you're working. So that's a good place to put notes as well, to explain, for example, fuel prices might be really, really high, or there might be in particular to where you're living or where you're going to be implementing your project, that would cause the transportation line to be higher than a funder might otherwise expect. So you'd want to make sure that you're explaining that as well. I think it's also important, if the funder doesn't specifically ask for it, I think it's important to provide a note somewhere, if you can, around the assumptions you're making about exchange rates and inflation that have been factored into your budget. Funders do generally ask for exchange rates used if they're asking for budgets in more than one currency, but sometimes if they're asking for budgets only in US dollars, for example, they might not ask for that. So you want to provide that information. That also gives them a clue that you've actually built out your budget in your own currency, which gives them an indication that it's a thoughtful budget as opposed to just round numbers you're putting into their template. So that's the budget notes piece. The other piece was the cost sharing, correct?
Yes. Could you please explain? There's a couple of follow-up questions about budget, so why don't I just ask the three? One is about cost sharing. Could you please explain cost sharing? Second is if you're unable to complete within the timeline given in the project, can you ask the funder for a no-cost extension, or in what cases? And then third is addressing the question of administrative costs, factoring in administrative costs into budget, because maybe sometimes funders aren't so willing to put a big budget line for admin, even though that's an important part of the project. So please address those three, and also all this great information coming out now, everyone. Please don't worry, because we're retaining the recording of the meeting. So if you're missing something there, then you'll be able to get it afterwards. So go ahead. Thank you.
Okay. So Katie, keep prompting me, okay? As I answer, I might forget what the next question is. So let's talk about cost sharing first. Cost sharing, generally speaking, if a funder puts it in their application form, it's going to be something that they use to decide whether to fund you or not. And by that, I mean, if a funder is putting it in the application, it means it's important to them, probably means they want to see cost sharing happening, and they will look more favorably on proposals that do have a cost sharing component. That said, cost sharing does not need to be hard cash. It doesn't need to be that you're going to go and get cash from another source that you contribute towards the project. Cost sharing can also be all of the assets and tools and human resources that you already have, and that don't necessarily, or that you're either already paying for or don't actually have a cash cost to your organization, that are being used to advance the project. So you could say, for example, if you are working with a CAI and you're applying for funding that's going to bypass, it's not going to go through a CAI, it's going to go directly to your project, you could include the technical advice that you get through ACAI as a cost sharing element. So you can ascribe a cost to what that would cost in the marketplace as something that is being contributed in kind as a cost sharing to your project. That makes sense. It can also include costs. So if you are paying for an office rental, what you pay in rent already, and you're not, if you're not including that in the project budget for the funder, you can include that as part of your cost share. That these are things that you are paying for that need to be there for the project to be successful, and therefore really in the big picture are part of the costs of operating that project that you are already contributing as an organization, or that one of your partners is contributing, or that the community is contributing. Another common, like small cost sharing pieces could be you're working in a community and a partner or a stakeholder in the community is giving you a place to hold your meetings and your trainings free of cost. So you're able to use that community resource or asset to support the implementation of your project at no cost, but you can include that as a in-kind venue rental contribution to the project. So I'm not sure if that was the direction of the question around cost sharing. So cost sharing is essentially what are you contributing in addition to what you're asking the funder to contribute. And that sort of, I think most funders, when they're asking that, their intent, or I guess what they're looking for in asking that question, is evidence that there is investment and commitment and ownership by your organization, by your partners, by other stakeholders, that it's not 100% dependent on them. And that's connected to sustainability considerations, right? that if literally every dollar or every input of the project is all on them, then that could raise questions around what will happen when the funding is over. Is there going to be any capacity for continuation of results or ongoing activity that's sort of building on what happened in the project? Did that answer whoever asked the cost sharing question?
The question was just, can you explain cost sharing? So I think that gives a good overview. Now the next question is about timelines and
Okay.
changes that come up during the project. So
and the no cost extension piece.
yes, and I'll just add
Yes.
add something to it, which is
Okay.
that if also unexpected issues like crop up during the project, a great example that we have right now is COVID-19. So that's impacted a
Yeah.
lot of projects in terms of their timelines, but also in terms of changing the costs that they had originally budgeted for. So what happens when COVID-19, for example, as an unexpected issue comes up and either escalates costs or delays the project? Can you ask for a no cost extension? Can you go back and ask for a supplementary budget? What do you advise in terms of unexpected issues coming up? Either your own or external factors.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to sort of answer that in two ways. One, I'm going to answer that from the perspective of what's the right thing to do. And then I'll talk a bit about different funders and how you might need to navigate different funding relationships in these cases. I think the right thing to do in these cases is to make sure, one, that your plan has at the beginning really considered all potential risks that you can think of. Obviously, COVID-19, no one would have seen that coming 6 months ago when writing a proposal for a project they're implementing now. So you can't always foresee everything, but probably if you've done a good job of thinking through the risks and thinking about how you are going to monitor your project along the way, you're going to be better equipped to address challenges even if they are unforeseen, because you're going to have a system in place as an organization to identify these challenges as they occur, and you're going to have a process internally for how you evaluate them and how you make decisions and how you adapt. Okay, so those are things that you can do at the outset to make sure that you're prepared for unforeseen circumstances. The second thing is to be very honest. The worst thing I think you can do probably with any funder is to pretend like you can achieve your originally planned results in the face of major changes like something like COVID-19. No project is going to achieve what it set out to achieve if it's working under these circumstances. So I think being honest about what is not going to happen is going to be really important. I think being honest about what needs to happen differently so that you can at least make some progress or achieve some of your initial results is also going to be important. The thing about a COVID-19 that is different from most of the unforeseen challenges you're likely to run into in your project work is that because this is global and it is so all-encompassing and it's all anyone's talking about, funders are being way more understanding and flexible around changes to projects because of COVID-19 than I think I've ever seen them be in relation to any other challenge. So if something happens that has the same sort of scale of impact of COVID-19, but is very particular to your country or your region, don't be surprised if funders are less flexible and a little bit less understanding because they understand it less. And they're also not getting directives from on high to be flexible necessarily. So that makes it a little bit more challenging if it's a context or a local context specific challenge. I think as far as no cost extensions go, think no cost extensions are a great way of ensuring that you can achieve results when there's been bumps along the road that you couldn't foresee. I think funders are more sympathetic and willing to approve no cost extensions when it's very clear that the reason the extension is being requested is because of an external factor, external variable, as opposed to we just didn't think it would take so long to do this component of our project. So if you've really thought through your timeline really well, then you should have a little bit of a buffer at the end. So if you've really allowed, say, the 2 months at the end of your 12-month project to be really all about monitoring and evaluation and reporting on results, then if you end up spilling into that with project activities a little bit, you're still okay. It just means you're going to have to work harder in those 2 months because you'll still have to do the monitoring and evaluation piece. So building in those buffers so that small shocks are not, you can weather and without really drastically changing your project or changing the timeline with your funder is also a good way to go. But yeah, no cost extensions certainly are something that you can look at when needed, and funders are generally open to that if you can really explain and articulate very clearly why it's needed and that you've thought through all the options essentially and why that's required. The only a caveat to that though as well is that funders also have funders essentially, right? So if you're getting money, say through a DFID or a USAID or a Global Affairs Canada, don't forget that they get their money from Parliament or from the budget department of the government. So they also have timelines and reporting requirements and results that they are reporting on to the people in power who hold the purse strings, really. So there is also the possibility that a funder will not be sympathetic to a request for a no cost extension because they have to do their own roll up of monitoring and evaluation and reporting based on the budget cycle for their organization as well. Yeah.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you, Claire. And the final question about budget is, could you please address the issue of administrative costs?
Right.
Some funders aren't willing to fund it, but even the best of proposal documents won't take off without good staff behind it.
Absolutely. So first, you're right. I think we all have, just like this is sort of an aside, but I think we all have a responsibility to be very upfront and honest with funders about what the administrative costs are to project implementation. You know, a lot of the administrative costs to implementing projects are costs that we incur because we're trying to do good work. And in fact, poorly designed projects that are not concerned about relationship building, that are not concerned about sustainability, that are not concerned about evidence and learning, have much lower overhead because they're not doing monitoring and evaluation, they're not holding meetings, they're not communicating effectively. So really, in some regards, I think your overhead expenses related to a project are kind of an indicator that it's going to be a well-managed project that is looking to create sort of long-term sustainable impact and build capacity as well. So I think it's important to be honest. Where there is limitations in a funder's guidelines, so they'll say they will only cover up into a particular amount, or often it's a percentage of the project budget, which I think personally is ridiculous because it costs the same amount in many cases expense lines are the same, whether it's a $50,000 project or a $250,000 project. And yet a lot of funders will say we'll only cover 10% admin. But it costs the same amount to travel out to a community regardless of their project budget, right? The transportation cost is the same. The cost of renting an office is the same. Like all of those costs are the same. So where you think that your project budget, your project is going to cost more in administration and oversight than the funder allows, I would definitely put that in your cost share so that at least you're being upfront with them about what it really costs so that they can see the difference between what they are being asked to fund and what the actual costs of that are. And that's a great way to include cost share. Say, well, we're covering rent because you won't cover it, but they at least know that. The other thing is to think about, what do funders mean by administration? It's a very gray term. Like, it's not actually a very clear term. It's often not explained explicitly what they mean by that and which expenses they consider to be administrative rather than project expenses. But I would say the safe distinction, and this is sort of the question, if I'm unsure when I'm working with a client or a project on the budget, if I'm unsure, the question I ask is this expense needed for the implementation of this project, or is this expense needed for the existence of your organization? Any project, any expense that is needed for the project to occur can likely be embedded in a budget line other than administration. Okay, so if you're, and I'll give you an example of that. If you say something like this, like conferencing technology. In today's reality, you may need conferencing technology to be able to have meetings with your stakeholders. You may not be able to travel to and from communities with ease in the way that we once could, or we will again, hopefully in the future. So conferencing technology might be something you need to have in order to have meetings with your project stakeholders. So the cost of, say, a premium account with Zoom so that you can do recordings and all of that, is that an administrative expense or is that a project expense? And I would say, if you cannot implement your project without being able to meet with your stakeholders through Zoom, then that is a project-related expense. And that is more suitable for a budget line around stakeholder engagement or training or capacity building or any of those other lines that where that level of activity would fit. Did that cover what you were looking for?
Yeah,
Ask the
that's
question.
great. There's a follow-up as well, if you don't mind, about different lines and stuff like that. So what's the difference, if any, between administrative costs and overhead compensation? And also, what about indirect costs? And what percentage of the budget usually goes as indirect costs, and what goes under that line? So difference between admin and overhead, is there one? And if so, what is it? And also, what are indirect costs, and usually how much can you put under that line?
Yeah, admin and overhead are often used interchangeably. I actually think overhead is better because I think it's more clear that it's about your organizational expenses. So we need to exist, which means we need to have a website and an office and financial statements and all of that, versus the costs of implementing the project and doing the work. So they are largely used interchangeably. And the what was I going to say? I had a thought and it just went in. I lost it. So, and the other part of the question was indirect costs. Is that correct? Was there a third component of the question that I missed?
That's it. Indirect costs and how much usually goes.
So indirect costs. who asked that question? Could you unmute and just explain, give me a little bit of context to what
Yeah. So that
you're talking
is
about?
from Tunji. Tunji, if you'd like to unmute yourself. Or I can try and look for you.
Hello.
Aha, there you are. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Your question
I,
about
I'm, I'm just
please.
I am just wondering, there has been some variation in terms of the percentage of the total budget that should be allocated to indirect costs. Indirect costs in terms of maybe payment for electricity, telephone and stuff like that. I mean,
Okay.
some say with 2%, some say 5%, you know. I just need to clarify to be sure of which one to use.
Okay, so it sounds like in the cases that you're speaking of, that they may be using indirect costs to mean sort of overhead, and like almost interchangeably with overhead. So it would be the cost, like as you said, like your electricity bill for the office or those sorts of expenses.
Yeah, electricity, fueling of the generator,
Yeah.
internet, stuff like that.
Yeah, so each funder, so those would be, yeah, overhead or admit, those would be in the overhead line, indirect line, administration line, and each funder is going to have its own guidelines around how much of that they will fund. So you have to follow whatever that funder says, and it could be 5%, it could be 10%. In Canada, Global Affairs Canada is 12%. So you have to follow that. I do recommend, if you can, to include the rest of it in your cost share. If whatever doesn't fit in there, if they do allow you to include cost share, then I would include that so that it's clear what the actual costs are. And unfortunately, as I said, you know, I think this is one of those injustices towards smaller projects, because the amount that you get for overhead on a small, like a lower budget project, is really too small to cover the basic operations of any organization, which I don't think is right. So I think it's really important that we let funders know how much things actually cost. The other thing, just as a consideration, and we can talk more about this, it's a bit confusing, but something to consider, especially if you're dealing with project proposals that are like larger grant amounts, that when they do provide administration funding for administration, that also can cycle back to the project in terms of cost share in some ways. So for example, if they will allow, say your administrative costs, your overhead costs do not change dramatically with the addition of the project, because you've done a really good job of making sure that all the project related costs, so all the costs that you're only incurring to implement that project, are being covered under project lines. And then you also get this 10% of administration support that's going to cover things you're already paying for, right? So it's being used to cover, say, the cost of your office rent that you were already paying for potentially with other fundraising revenue. That additional funding actually can be used to cycle back into the project as well. And that's something we're going to talk about in more detail at the next training when we're looking more at the budget.
Okay, thank you.
Great, thanks. And we've got a guest on the line, Laurent from Ghana, and he's got his hand up now, and I think he wants to make a contribution. So Laurent, go ahead, please.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, loud and clear.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks, Claire. I think what you are talking about, cost sharing, is very clear. What I wanted to add uh, as going activities need to be aligned by the community who is beneficiating from the initiative to know that what the past projects have done, what the ongoing projects are doing, then the ongoing project can do parallel activities with this project that will be requesting funds from funders, and those one can be considered as well as cost sharing. But in the meantime as well, if we consider 5, 10, or 12% as administrative costs, what those who are applying need to understand that we are talking about community-based adaptation project, meaning that most of activities need to be implemented at local level where the beneficiaries are. Then I would see that the possibility of having a cost sharing is to see how some activities and some costs can be inserted in the budget line of each activity. That's why it's so important for those who are applying to understand the beneficiaries, to understand the context, to understand the project they are proposing, then understand activities they will be doing, and make sure that they will do a kind of a deep research on the budget, that they will understand each budget line, then they can easily know what is the margin will be left for each activities and how they will cover the costs on the administration side, because that one is usually a non-negotiable areas for funders. If they say 5% is 5%, then if you go over, you are mismanaging the funds. Then they need to make sure that they need to have that approach where each budget for activities is well understood, well calculated, and to leave a small margin where they can insert that possibility of having a small overhead on each budget line. That's why I wanted to contribute on that one and make sure that the need is well assessed, and we will not fund the project with that when we were talking about the logic framework, that's where they need to know what is the real impact, and those impact need to be linked with outcome and output, and know what is the real budget for each activity. Then they need to know that one, that part they need to understand it very well, that it will not really look like activities are implemented, or they will be ticking the case of implemented activities while the budget has not responded or is not aligned with the activity that has been planned. That's my small contribution on that one. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Laurent.
Thank you. Just one more hand up, if you don't mind, from Andrew. Go ahead, Andrew.
Yeah, thank you very much for the beautiful presentation. Mine is just a contribution too. I did like to let everyone here know that administrative cost should not be what is very important. What is more important is money to implement the project, which if we continue to dwell more on administrative costs, you end up not doing the project. So I did like people to focus on how they can get a budget that could implement the project. I also want to also say, speaking about budget and activities. I mean, for example, if you want to acquire some equipment, many funders will want to see what experience you have in those equipments. For example, if you have one tractor, I mean, your budget will be okay. We have one tractor, and because of the level of the increased number of projects, we'll need additional 2 tractors. That makes a lot of sense, to get more money for tractors. Yeah, I think it's also good, like the last speaker said, it's very good for people here to understand how logical framework works, how you can actually link activities with the expected outcomes. Like you talked about goals. It's very important. These are the very, very important points we should all take home from this program. I'm not talking about administrative costs. Yeah, because that's not the project. We should. I mean, if we get our administrative costs and we're not able to implement the project, then the project has failed. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And go ahead, Claire.
Okay, last piece of the project plan is your plan for monitoring and evaluation. And I actually like to think of it more as monitoring, evaluation, and learning. So it's a cycle. But this is where you're going to map out how you're going to measure your results, or what is the evidence that you are going to provide to show that you've achieved your project goals or your impact. And this is very important because what you're looking at, like when we talked about the logic model, we're not talking about proving that you did what you said you were going to do, but rather proving that you achieved change as you promised to do. So using the example of the training farmers in climate adaptive agricultural techniques, it's really easy to say we trained 50 farmers and here's the attendance list that proves that 50 farmers attended that training. Fantastic. Funders are not going to accept that as being, it's not good enough. Funders also want to know, and I think you want to know, we all want to know for our own selves as well, for our own learning about our work and our practice. Did the farmers we train actually retain the new knowledge? So how are you going to find out whether the training was effective in helping farmers to develop the new knowledge and skills? So you need a way of asking that question and gathering evidence to show that your training worked. You're also going to want to have evidence that shows that farmers put the new knowledge and skills into practice and actually implement those new techniques in their farming practice. So how are you going to find that out? So it's really about thinking about how you're going to measure, monitor, and evaluate change, as opposed to simply proving that you did what you said you would do, which was to train those farmers. So at each level of outcome or impact, you're going to have to think through, how are we going to find out whether our assumptions held true, whether the change actually took place. And we can talk in detail when we talk about, when we look at this part of the project plan in the next training as well, to what that looks like and what the different kinds of data collection tools and methods and indicators you can use that would be appropriate for your project. But essentially, these are the 5 pieces of your project plan that you should have in place. And whether you choose to use the template that we will that we use here at CAP Network, or if you have your own project building tool that you use and you're comfortable with, whatever process you use, you just need to make sure that that process is going to allow you to think through each of these 5 elements and to store them in a place that is accessible, so that when a funding proposal or a call for proposals comes out, you can easily pull those tools out, see all the information, and jump into the process then of writing proposals. So